Welcome to Dusk and Empires. Tonight, we follow the tragic final chapter of Mary Queen of Scots, as royal ambition crumbles into captivity and her 18-year imprisonment draws toward its inevitable, sorrowful end. If this sounds like your kind of bedtime story, subscribe before you drift off. Now get comfortable, close your eyes, and let history carry you to sleep. Close your eyes now, and let your breathing slow to match the rhythm of centuries past. Feel your body settling into the soft embrace of rest, as we journey back through the mists of time to 16th century Scotland. The air grows cool around you, carrying the scent of heather and the distant sultang of northern seas. You are safe here, wrapped in the gentle darkness, as we prepare to walk alongside one of history's most tragic and compelling figures. Picture the rolling highlands of Scotland, where ancient castles rise like stone dreams from emerald landscapes. The year is 1542, and a kingdom trembles on the edge of destiny. In the royal chambers of Linlithgow Palace, a young queen draws her first breath, unknowing that her life will become a tapestry of love, betrayal, and ultimate sacrifice. Mary Stuart, who will become known to history as Mary Queen of Scots, enters a world of political intrigue that will shape not only her own fate, but the destiny of nations. Let the weight of centuries settle around you like a warm blanket. Feel yourself drifting back to those turbulent times when queens were pawns in games of power, when religious divides tore kingdoms apart, and when a woman's crown could become both her greatest triumph and her heaviest burden. Tonight, we will follow Mary's journey from the gilded halls of French courts to the cold stone walls of English prisons, from the heights of royal power to the shadow of the executioner's block. Rest now, and let history carry you gently into sleep. In the bitter cold of December 1542, as snow began to dust the battlements of Linlithgow Palace, the fate of Scotland hung in the balance of a newborn's cry. Mary Stuart entered the world at a moment when her kingdom stood at the crossroads of history, her father King James V lying on his deathbed at Falkland Palace, worn down by defeat and despair. The messenger who brought news of his daughter's birth to the dying king was met with words that would echo through the centuries: "It can why alas, and it will gang why alas." James spoke of the Stuart dynasty, which had come to the Scottish throne through Marjorie Bruce, and perhaps in his fevered mind, he glimpsed the tragic fate that awaited his infant daughter. The Scotland into which Mary was born was a land of contradictions, breathtakingly beautiful yet brutally harsh, proud yet perpetually threatened. The highlands rose like sleeping giants wrapped in mist, their peaks crowned with snow that caught the pale winter light like scattered diamonds. Ancient clan loyalties ran deeper than any royal decree, and the very stones of the castle seemed to whisper stories of blood feuds and ancient grudges. In the lowlands, fertile fields stretched toward the border with England, that ever-present neighbor whose shadow fell across Scottish politics like a storm cloud that never quite broke into rain. The scent of peat fires drifted from humble cottages where common folk went about their daily lives, largely unaware that their new queen was barely 6 days old when she inherited a throne that had never known peace for long. At Linlithgow Palace, where Mary had been born, the walls themselves seemed to hold their breath in anticipation. The palace, with its great hall and royal apartments, had witnessed generations of Scottish royalty, but never had it sheltered a queen so young, so vulnerable, so desperately needed by a nation teetering on the edge of chaos. The infant Mary lay in her cradle, swaddled in the finest silks and furs that Scotland could provide, unaware that powerful men were already plotting her future, already seeing her not as a child but as a political tool to be wielded in the great game of European politics. Cardinal David Beaton, the most powerful churchman in Scotland, stood as one of her guardians, his red robes a stark contrast to the pale stone walls as he gazed upon the child who would determine whether Scotland remained Catholic or fell to the Protestant reforms sweeping across Europe. The political maneuvering began before Mary could even lift her head. King Henry VIII of England, that great bear of a man whose will had already reshaped his own nation, cast his covetous eye northward and saw opportunity in Scotland's vulnerability. His vision was grand and terrible in its simplicity. If his young son Edward could be betrothed to the infant Mary, the two kingdoms might finally be united under English rule, ending centuries of border warfare and bringing the troublesome Scots to heel. The Treaty of Greenwich, signed when Mary was not yet a year old, promised her hand to Prince Edward, but the document's ink was barely dry before Scottish pride began to rebel against what many saw as the first step toward English domination. In the nurseries of Linlithgow Palace, Mary's earliest days were spent surrounded by the luxury befitting a queen, yet shadowed by the constant threat of kidnapping, assassination, or political marriage. Her wet nurses were chosen not just for their health and character, but for their loyalty to the crown, their families held as guarantees of their discretion. The very air the infant breathed seemed thick with conspiracy, and even her food was tasted by others before it touched her lips. French gold flowed into Scotland to counter English influence, while English spies worked to ensure that the marriage treaty would be honored. Cardinal Beaton, growing ever more suspicious of English intentions, began to dream of a different alliance entirely, one that would preserve both Scottish independence and Catholic faith. As Mary grew from infant to toddler, taking her first tentative steps across floors of polished stone, the political landscape of Scotland continued to shift like sand beneath her tiny feet. The rough wooing, as historians would later call Henry VIII's increasingly violent attempts to force the marriage alliance, brought English armies across the border in 1544 and again in 1545. The sound of distant cannon fire sometimes echoed through the palace walls, reminding all within that Mary's very existence had made Scotland a battleground. Yet in her protected world of silk hangings and carved wooden toys, the child queen remained largely innocent of the chaos her birth had unleashed, playing with dolls while men died in her name, learning to walk while her kingdom stumbled toward an uncertain future. The ship that carried 5-year-old Mary Stuart away from Scotland in the summer of 1548 seemed to sail not just across the waters of the North Sea, but across the boundary between two different worlds. Behind her lay the mist-shrouded highlands of her birth, where ancient clan loyalties ran deeper than rivers and the very air tasted of freedom and defiance. Ahead lay France, that glittering jewel of Renaissance Europe, where art and culture flourished under royal patronage, where courtly love was elevated to high art, and where a young Scottish queen would learn the sophisticated games of power that would later prove both her making and her undoing. As the Scottish coastline faded into memory, Mary stood at the ship's rail with her 4 companions, the young noblewomen who shared her name and would share her exile: Mary Seton, Mary Beaton, Mary Fleming, and Mary Livingston, the 4 Marys who would become her dearest friends and most loyal servants. The journey to France was Mary's first taste of the wider world beyond Scotland's borders, and it opened her eyes to possibilities she had never imagined. The ship itself was a marvel of craftsmanship, its sails billowing with wind that carried the sense of foreign lands, its hold filled with gifts from Scottish nobles eager to curry favor with their young queen. As they sailed south along the English coast, Mary caught glimpses of the enemy kingdom that had tried to claim her through marriage, its white cliffs rising from waters that had witnessed countless battles between English and French fleets. The child who had known only the rough stone walls of Scottish castles now found herself in a floating palace, attended by servants who spoke in the musical cadences of French, surrounded by luxuries that surpassed anything in her homeland. When Mary's ship finally reached the French port of Roscoff in Brittany, she stepped onto soil that would shape her character for the rest of her life. France in 1548 was experiencing the full flowering of Renaissance culture under King Henri II, a land where chateaux rose like fairy tale dreams from manicured landscapes, where poetry and music were as valued as military prowess, where the art of conversation was refined to an exquisite science. The court of France moved like a glittering caravan from palace to palace throughout the year, following an ancient rhythm of seasons and ceremonies that had been perfected over centuries. Mary was immediately swept into this world of unprecedented luxury and sophistication, her Scottish burr gradually giving way to the elegant French that would become her preferred language, her simple Scottish dress replaced by the sumptuous silks and velvets that marked a true daughter of France. At the Château de Saint-Germain-en-Laye, where Mary spent much of her childhood, life unfolded like an elaborate tapestry woven from threads of gold and silver. The palace itself was a masterpiece of Renaissance architecture, its long galleries filled with portraits of French kings and queens, its gardens designed with geometric precision that spoke of humanity's triumph over nature's chaos. Here Mary learned not just the arts befitting a queen, but the subtle skills of survival in a court where every word carried weight, every gesture conveyed meaning, every friendship might prove valuable or dangerous depending on the shifting currents of political favor. Her tutors were the finest scholars in France, men who opened her mind to the classics of Latin and Greek literature, to the emerging philosophies of humanism that placed individual worth above blind obedience to tradition, to the histories of great rulers who had shaped the destiny of nations through force of will and brilliance of mind. The betrothal that had brought Mary to France bound her to the Dauphin François, heir to the French throne, and their childhood together was like something from a courtly romance. François was a delicate boy, younger than Mary and often sickly, but possessed of a gentle nature that complemented her more passionate temperament. They were raised almost as siblings, sharing tutors and companions, their futures intertwined by treaties signed before either could read or write. In the gardens of Fontainebleau, where fountains played among perfectly trimmed hedges and peacocks strutted across lawns that seemed too perfect to be real, Mary and François walked hand in hand, 2 children carrying the weight of kingdoms on their young shoulders. Their romance, if it could be called that, was as much creation of diplomacy as of affection, yet contemporary accounts suggest genuine fondness between them, a partnership built on shared experience and mutual understanding of their unique burdens. As Mary grew from child to young woman, her beauty became legendary throughout the courts of Europe. She stood tall for her time, with the elegant bearing that marked her Stuart heritage, her auburn hair catching light like burnished copper, her complexion fair as Highland mist touched by dawn. Yet it was not merely her physical appearance that drew attention, but the intelligence that sparkled in her eyes, the wit that enlivened her conversation, the magnetic presence that seemed to draw people into her orbit whether she wished it or not. Foreign ambassadors wrote to their masters describing the young Queen of Scots as the most accomplished princess of her generation, fluent in French, Latin, Spanish, and Italian, skilled in rhetoric and theology, capable of holding her own in debates with the most learned men of the age. She embodied the Renaissance ideal of the complete ruler, one who combined classical learning with practical wisdom, artistic accomplishment with political acumen. The French court's influence on Mary extended far beyond mere education or cultural polish. It shaped her very understanding of what it meant to be royal. In France, she observed how great nobles lived, how they managed their vast estates, how they balanced loyalty to the crown with advancement of their own interests. She learned the intricate dance of court politics, where alliances formed and dissolved like morning mist, where today's enemy might become tomorrow's essential ally, where survival depended upon reading the subtle signs that others missed. The court of Henri II was particularly treacherous territory, dominated by the powerful Guise family who were Mary's maternal relatives, constantly at odds with rival factions who saw the young Scottish queen as a threat to their own ambitions. Through observation and gradual participation, Mary acquired the skills that would serve her well in Scotland, though she could not have foreseen how quickly those skills would be put to the test. When Mary was 15, her wedding to the Dauphin François transformed her from Scottish exile to potential Queen of France, the most powerful throne in Christian Europe. The ceremony, held at Notre Dame Cathedral in Paris on April 24, 1558, was a spectacle that dazzled even a court accustomed to magnificence. Mary wore a gown of white silk so encrusted with jewels that witnesses claimed it seemed to capture and reflect every ray of light in the cathedral, creating an almost supernatural radiance around the young bride. The crown of Scotland rested upon her head, while the crown of France awaited her in the future, and for a moment it seemed that this girl who had left her homeland as a political refugee might return as the most powerful woman in the world. Yet even in her moment of greatest triumph, the seeds of future tragedy were already being sown, for the marriage contract contained secret clauses that would give France permanent control over Scotland should Mary die without heir, effectively ending Scottish independence forever. The news that would forever alter Mary's destiny arrived on a December morning in 1560, carried by a messenger whose horse's hooves echoed like drumbeats across the frozen courtyard of the Château de Fontainebleau. King François II of France, Mary's husband of barely 18 months, was dead at the age of 16, felled by an ear infection that had developed into a brain abscess. In a single moment, Mary Stuart transformed from Queen of France and Scotland to a widowed teenager whose position at the French court had become suddenly precarious, her future uncertain, her very survival dependent upon decisions she would have to make with wisdom far beyond her 18 years. The woman who had been raised in luxury beyond imagination, who had known only the protection of the most powerful monarchy in Europe, now found herself standing at the crossroads of destiny with only her own intelligence and determination to guide her. The France that had sheltered Mary through her formative years now seemed strangely cold and unwelcoming. Catherine de' Medici, the queen mother who had never fully accepted the young Scottish queen's influence over her son, made it clear that Mary's presence was no longer essential to French interests. The court that had once revolved around Mary and François now treated her with the polite deference due to a foreign guest rather than the devotion owed to a queen. In the galleries of Fontainebleau where she had once walked as future Queen of France, Mary now paced as a woman without a country, her white morning gown a stark reminder of dreams that had died with her young husband. The four Marys who had shared her exile gathered around their queen like protective spirits, their loyalty unwavering even as the ground shifted beneath their feet. For 13 months, Mary remained in France, weighing her options with the careful deliberation of a master chess player contemplating a move that could determine the outcome of the entire game. She could remain in France as the Dowager Queen, living in comfortable obscurity on her widow's pension, perhaps eventually remarrying into French nobility and disappearing into the gentle twilight of a provincial life. She could seek another royal marriage, using her beauty and accomplishments to secure a throne in Spain, Austria, or one of the Italian states where her Stuart bloodline and royal education would make her an attractive bride. Or she could return to Scotland, that mist-shrouded land of her birth which she barely remembered, to claim the crown that was hers by right of blood but which would require all her strength and cunning to hold. When Mary finally made her decision to return to Scotland, it was with full knowledge of the challenges that awaited her. She was a Catholic queen returning to rule a Protestant nation, a woman shaped by French culture attempting to govern a people who had grown increasingly suspicious of foreign influence, a ruler who had been absent during the most crucial years of her country's history now expected to provide the leadership that would determine its future. Yet Mary faced these daunting prospects with the confidence that her French education had instilled in her, the belief that intelligence, charm, and political skill could overcome any obstacle, that a queen who truly understood the art of statecraft could find a way to reconcile seemingly irreconcilable differences. As her ships prepared to sail from Calais in the summer of 1561, Mary stood once more at a ship's rail, gazing toward a homeland that existed more in imagination than memory, carrying with her the hopes and fears of two nations. The Scotland that greeted Mary upon her return was a land of startling contrasts that seemed to embody all the contradictions of her own position. Edinburgh, her capital, was a city of soaring stone tenements that climbed impossibly steep streets toward the castle that crowned its rocky summit, a fortress that had been old when her ancestors first claimed the Scottish throne. The Royal Mile stretched like a spine down from the castle to Holyroodhouse Palace, lined with the homes of merchants and craftsmen whose prosperity depended upon trade with England and the continent. Yet venture beyond the city walls, and one entered a different world entirely, where Highland clans still lived by codes of honor and vengeance that predated Christianity itself, where ancient Gaelic customs persisted despite the efforts of lowland reformers to impose uniformity of belief and practice. It was into this complex, divided realm that Mary Stuart returned as queen, bringing with her the sophistication of Renaissance Europe but needing to rediscover the primal loyalties that were the true foundation of Scottish power. The first test of Mary's political skill came before she had even established herself in her ancestral palace of Holyroodhouse. John Knox, the great reformer whose History of the Reformation in Scotland had become the sacred text of Scottish Protestantism, demanded an audience with his Catholic queen, ostensibly to pay his respects but actually to take the measure of this foreign-educated woman who now claimed dominion over God's chosen people. The meeting, held in the palace's great hall where generations of Scottish kings had held court, was a collision between two irreconcilable worldviews, the learned priest-queen who believed in the ancient authority of the Catholic Church facing the fiery prophet who proclaimed that all authority came from God alone and was mediated through scripture rather than tradition. Knox, his black robes severe against the rich tapestries that decorated the hall, spoke with the confidence of a man who believed he carried God's own commission, while Mary, resplendent in the silk and cloth of gold that marked her royal station, responded with the measured rhetoric she had learned in French court debates. Their theological arguments echoed off stone walls that had witnessed centuries of similar confrontations, each participant absolutely certain of their position, neither willing to concede ground on matters they considered essential to salvation itself. Knox challenged Mary's right to hear Mass in her private chapel, claiming that the true religion of Scotland could not coexist with what he termed the idolatrous practices of Rome. Mary responded with questions about the authority of subjects to dictate religious observance to their sovereign, pointing out that she had promised to make no changes to the Protestant settlement while expecting the same tolerance for her own conscience. The debate revealed the fundamental tension that would define Mary's entire reign. Could a Catholic monarch successfully rule a Protestant nation, or would the religious divide ultimately prove insurmountable? As Knox left the palace, his stern features betraying no satisfaction with the outcome, Mary must have realized that her greatest challenges would come not from foreign enemies but from her own subjects, men and women who questioned not just her policies but her very right to rule. Despite these religious tensions, Mary's early years as Scotland's resident queen were marked by surprising success in navigating the treacherous waters of 16th-century politics. Her natural intelligence, enhanced by her French education, allowed her to identify key allies among the Scottish nobility while gradually building bridges with moderate Protestant leaders who were willing to accept a Catholic queen provided she respected the religious settlement. The Earl of Moray, her illegitimate half-brother, became her most trusted advisor, his Protestant credentials providing cover for policies that might otherwise have aroused suspicion among the reformers. Mary demonstrated remarkable skill in balancing competing factions, using her charm and wit to diffuse potentially explosive situations, showing just enough flexibility to maintain her position without compromising the principles she considered non-negotiable. Visitors to her court at Holyroodhouse described a young queen who had successfully transplanted French Renaissance culture to Scottish soil, creating an atmosphere of learning and refinement that had been absent from Scotland for generations while still honoring the ancient traditions that bound her to her people. For a brief, shining moment, it seemed that Mary Stuart might indeed prove capable of healing Scotland's divisions and leading her nation toward a future of prosperity and peace. In the candlelit chambers of Holyrood House Palace, where shadows danced across tapestries depicting the heroic deeds of Scottish kings, Mary Queen of Scots began to experience the first stirrings of a passion that would ultimately lead to her downfall. The year was 1564, and Mary had been back in Scotland for 3 years, establishing herself as a capable ruler who had managed to maintain the delicate balance between her Catholic faith and her Protestant subjects. Yet despite her political success, there remained a growing awareness among her advisors that the 21-year-old queen needed a husband, both to secure the succession and to provide the male authority that 16th-century political theory considered essential for effective rule. The great royal marriage market of Europe beckoned, with princes and archdukes from across the continent being evaluated as potential consorts for the beautiful Scottish queen whose hand could bring with it not only her own kingdom but a claim to the English throne that might prove invaluable in future generations. Among the glittering array of European nobility who sought Mary's hand, one figure stood out for reasons that had nothing to do with political advantage and everything to do with the mysterious alchemy of attraction. Henry Stuart, Lord Darnley, was himself a descendant of Scottish royalty, his grandmother being Margaret Tudor, sister to Henry VIII, making him Mary's cousin and giving him his own claim to both Scottish and English thrones. When Darnley arrived at the Scottish court in February 1565, ostensibly to visit his father the Earl of Lennox but actually as part of a carefully orchestrated plan to present himself as a suitor, Mary encountered for the first time a man who could match her in height, beauty, and royal bloodline. Standing nearly 6 feet tall in an age when most men barely reached Mary's shoulder, Darnley possessed the golden hair and fair complexion that Renaissance aesthetics considered the pinnacle of masculine beauty, combined with accomplishments in music, poetry, and courtly sports that made him seem like a figure from romantic literature rather than political reality. The courtship that followed unfolded like a scene from the very romances that Mary had read in her youth at the French court, filled with stolen glances across crowded halls, whispered conversations in shadowed alcoves, and the gradual discovery of shared interests and mutual attraction. Darnley proved himself an accomplished musician, able to accompany Mary on the lute while she sang the French songs that reminded her of her happier days at Fontainebleau. He shared her love of poetry, quoting verses from fashionable sonnets while they walked together through the gardens of Holyrood House, where early spring flowers bloomed despite the chill Scottish air. Most intoxicating of all, Darnley treated Mary not as a political prize to be won through calculation and treaty, but as a woman to be wooed through charm and romantic gesture, awakening in her emotions that had lain dormant through her brief, largely ceremonial marriage to the sickly French king. For the first time in her life, Mary Stuart was experiencing love not as a diplomatic arrangement but as a force of nature, overwhelming and irresistible. The political implications of Mary's growing attraction to Darnley were immediately apparent to her more experienced advisors, who watched with growing alarm as their queen began to make decisions with her heart rather than her head. The Earl of Moray, Mary's half-brother and chief counsellor, recognized that a marriage to Darnley would upset the careful balance of power that had kept Scotland stable since Mary's return. Darnley's Catholicism would alarm Protestant nobles who had accepted Mary partly because her foreign upbringing seemed to distance her from Scottish religious conflicts, while his English connections would revive fears of foreign domination that had been dormant since the rough wooing of Henry VIII. More dangerous still, Darnley's own claim to the throne could create a rival centre of power, particularly if he proved ambitious enough to seek the crown matrimonial that would make him king in his own right rather than merely the queen's consort. Yet when Moray attempted to counsel caution, Mary responded with an imperious authority that brooked no opposition, making it clear that she would marry whom she pleased regardless of political consequences. The speed with which Mary and Darnley's relationship progressed from courtly flirtation to passionate obsession alarmed even those who might otherwise have supported the match. Within weeks of his arrival, Darnley had been granted the title of Earl of Ross and was openly treated as the Queen's intended husband, despite the lack of any formal betrothal or approval from the Scottish Parliament. Mary showered her beloved with gifts of jewels, fine clothes, and horses, depleting the royal treasury in her eagerness to see Darnley dressed in a manner befitting his new status. She insisted that he be given precedence over all other nobles at court functions, a breach of protocol that offended powerful families who had supported her since her return to Scotland. Most shocking of all to observers familiar with Mary's previous diplomatic sophistication, she seemed utterly indifferent to the growing opposition her romance was generating among the very people whose support was essential to her continued rule. The French ambassador reported to his master that the Scottish queen appeared to be under some kind of enchantment, acting with a reckless passion that seemed completely at odds with her previously cautious political instincts. The wedding of Mary and Darnley, celebrated at Holyrood House on July 29, 1565, marked both the pinnacle of Mary's personal happiness and the beginning of her political downfall. The ceremony itself was a masterpiece of royal pageantry, with Mary wearing a black gown according to Scottish tradition, her auburn hair crowned with a circlet of gold and pearls that caught the light streaming through the palace chapel's stained glass windows. Darnley, resplendent in cloth of gold and silver, seemed to embody every romantic ideal of princely beauty as he pledged his troth to the woman who had elevated him from minor nobleman to king consort in the space of a few months. The feast that followed featured delicacies imported from France and Italy, wines that had aged in the cellars of royal chateaux, entertainment provided by musicians and dancers who transformed the great hall of Holyrood House into a scene of unprecedented magnificence. For one perfect summer day, it seemed that Mary Stuart had achieved the impossible, combining romantic fulfillment with royal duty, personal happiness with political success. Yet even as the wedding celebrations continued late into the night, the seeds of future catastrophe were already beginning to sprout. The Earl of Moray, denied permission to attend the wedding due to his continued opposition to the match, had withdrawn from court, taking with him several other powerful nobles whose absence created a dangerous political vacuum. In the borders, ancient feuds were rekindling as rival families sensed that the Queen's preoccupation with romance had weakened royal authority, while in the Highlands, clan chiefs began to question whether a queen so obviously ruled by passion could provide the strong leadership that Scotland required to maintain its independence. More ominously still, Darnley himself was already showing signs that his character could not support the weight of the honors Mary had heaped upon him, his natural arrogance amplified by sudden elevation to a status he had never expected to achieve. The young man who had won Mary's heart through romantic gestures and courtly accomplishments now began to reveal a darker side, marked by petty jealousy, violent temper, and an insatiable appetite for power that would ultimately destroy not only their marriage but Mary's reign itself. The honeymoon period of Mary and Darnley's marriage lasted barely through the autumn of 1565, dissolving like morning mist before the harsh realities of Scottish politics and Darnley's increasingly erratic behavior. The romantic prince who had swept Mary off her feet revealed himself to be vain, petulant, and utterly lacking in the political judgment necessary for his elevated position. Darnley began demanding the crown matrimonial that would make him king in his own right, threatening to leave Scotland if Mary refused to grant him authority equal to her own. When Mary, guided by advisers who understood the constitutional implications of such a concession, refused to compromise her own sovereignty, Darnley responded with drinking bouts, public scenes, and increasingly open contempt for his wife's authority. The man who had once quoted poetry in moonlit gardens now spent his nights in Edinburgh taverns, consorting with prostitutes and bragging drunkenly about his royal bloodline while insulting the very nobles whose support Mary needed to maintain her throne. As winter settled over Scotland, the queen who had sacrificed political advantage for romantic love found herself trapped in a marriage that threatened to destroy everything she had worked to achieve. The winter of 1565 brought to Scotland a figure whose presence would ignite passions and jealousies that would ultimately consume the Scottish court in flames of violence and betrayal. David Riccio arrived at Holyrood House Palace as part of the diplomatic mission from the Duke of Savoy, a slight, dark-complexioned man whose modest appearance concealed a sharp intelligence and sophisticated understanding of European politics. Originally intended to serve merely as a bass singer in Mary's chapel choir, Riccio possessed a musical talent that soon brought him to the Queen's attention, but it was his quick wit, his knowledge of languages, and his intimate familiarity with continental affairs that would elevate him far beyond his humble origins. In a court increasingly dominated by Scottish nobles who viewed the wider world with suspicion and hostility, Riccio represented a connection to the sophisticated international culture that Mary had known in France, a reminder of possibilities that lay beyond the narrow confines of Edinburgh's stone walls. Mary's friendship with the Italian musician developed gradually, built upon shared cultural interests and a mutual appreciation for the finer aspects of Renaissance civilization. Riccio could discuss poetry in Italian, debate theology in Latin, and provide informed commentary on the complex web of alliances and rivalries that connected the courts of Europe in an endless dance of diplomacy and intrigue. When Mary needed correspondence translated from Italian or Spanish, when she required advice on continental fashions or customs, when she simply wanted conversation with someone whose education matched her own, she increasingly turned to the soft-spoken musician whose knowledge seemed to encompass all subjects. As Darnley's behavior became more erratic and his company less pleasant, Mary found in Riccio a source of the intellectual companionship that her position as queen made difficult to find among her Scottish subjects. The long winter evenings at Holyrood House often found the Queen and her Italian secretary closeted together in her private chambers, working on correspondence or simply talking about books, music, and ideas while the wind howled around the ancient palace walls. Riccio's rapid rise from chapel singer to private secretary, and then to one of Mary's most trusted advisors, created tensions within the Scottish court that reflected deeper anxieties about foreign influence and royal favoritism. Proud Scottish nobles who could trace their lineage back to the companions of Robert the Bruce found themselves passed over in favor of a man they regarded as a foreign upstart, a mere musician elevated above his natural station by royal caprice. The Earl of Morton, whose Douglas family had long held positions of power and influence, watched with growing resentment as the Italian gained access to state secrets and royal favor that had traditionally belonged to the great families of Scotland. Even more galling to the Protestant nobility was Riccio's obvious Catholicism and his suspected role in encouraging Mary's correspondence with the Pope and other Catholic powers, correspondence that raised fears of a counter-Reformation plot to restore papal authority in Scotland by force if necessary. In taverns and castle halls throughout the lowlands, whispered conversations speculated about the exact nature of the Queen's relationship with her Italian secretary, insinuations that reflected not only personal jealousy but political calculation designed to undermine Mary's authority by attacking her reputation. The transformation of Riccio from musician to political advisor coincided with Mary's growing alienation from her husband Darnley, whose petulant behavior and violent temper had made him an increasingly unwelcome presence even in his own marriage chamber. As Darnley descended into alcoholism and debauchery, spending his nights in Edinburgh's seediest establishments while neglecting his royal duties, Mary turned increasingly to the small circle of advisors who could provide the informed counsel that effective governance required. Riccio's position within this circle reflected not romantic infatuation, as Mary's enemies claimed, but simple political necessity, the recognition that managing Scotland's complex relationship with European powers required expertise that few Scottish nobles possessed. Yet the very rationality of Mary's reliance on Riccio only inflamed the jealousy of those who had been excluded from her inner circle, creating a volatile mixture of personal resentment and political opposition that needed only a spark to explode into open rebellion. The crisis that would destroy both Riccio and Mary's political position began to build in early 1566, as news spread throughout Scotland that the Queen was expecting her first child. The pregnancy, which should have been a cause for universal celebration as it promised to secure the royal succession, instead became another source of controversy and speculation among Mary's enemies. Darnley, whose increasingly public estrangement from his wife had made their marital difficulties common knowledge, began to question whether he was truly the father of Mary's child, accusations that reflected both his own guilt over his infidelities and his growing paranoia about his wife's relationship with her advisors. These suspicions, whether genuine or calculated, provided Darnley with the perfect excuse to align himself with the Protestant nobles who had opposed his marriage from the beginning but who now saw him as a useful tool for destroying the Italian who had gained such influence over their queen. The conspiracy that began to form around Darnley's wounded pride and political ambition would soon engulf the Scottish court in violence that would shock even an age accustomed to brutal political solutions. The plot against Riccio brought together an unlikely alliance of disaffected nobles united more by what they opposed than by any common vision of Scotland's future. The Earl of Morton, whose ruthless pragmatism had made him one of Scotland's most feared political operators, saw in Riccio's removal an opportunity to reassert the traditional authority of the great noble families over royal policy. Lord Ruthven, a man whose reputation for violence was matched only by his Protestant zeal, viewed the Italian as an agent of papal conspiracy whose elimination was essential to preserve Scotland's religious independence. The Earl of Lindsey, whose ancient family had served Scottish kings for generations, convinced himself that removing foreign influence from the court was a patriotic duty that justified any means necessary to accomplish it. Most crucially, they found in Darnley a royal accomplice whose participation would provide legal cover for what might otherwise appear to be simple murder, transforming assassination into an act of state justice carried out with the king's authority. Through the winter months of 1566, these men met in secret, their conversations lit by flickering candles in castle chambers where the stone walls held their whispered plans like deadly secrets waiting to be unleashed. The evening of March 9, 1566, began peacefully enough at Holyrood House Palace, with Mary entertaining a small party of friends at supper in her private chambers on the second floor of the palace's north tower. The queen, now 6 months pregnant, sat at the head of a small table, her condition evident beneath the rich velvets and silks that marked her royal station. Riccio occupied his customary place at her side, participating in the kind of civilized conversation that had made these intimate gatherings a pleasant respite from the formal ceremonies of court life. The Countess of Argyll, one of Mary's few trusted female companions, provided gentle conversation about domestic matters and court gossip, while Arthur Erskine, the Queen's equerry, regaled the company with amusing stories from his recent travels to France. Candles cast warm pools of light across the table where silver plates reflected the flames, creating an atmosphere of domestic tranquility that seemed far removed from the violent currents flowing through Scottish politics. Outside, March winds rattled the palace windows, but within the Queen's private chambers, all seemed peaceful and secure, the very picture of royal domesticity that Mary had worked so hard to establish since her return to Scotland. The first sign of approaching disaster came with the unexpected arrival of Darnley, who had spent most recent evenings drinking in Edinburgh taverns rather than attending his pregnant wife. His sudden appearance at the supper table, accompanied by his usual retinue of hangers-on, brought an immediate chill to the previously warm atmosphere, Mary's expression tightening as she observed her husband's flushed face and unsteady gait that indicated he had already been drinking heavily. Darnley took his seat with exaggerated ceremony, his manner suggesting some hidden knowledge that pleased him greatly, his eyes avoiding direct contact with Mary while flickering constantly toward Riccio with undisguised malevolence. The conversation, which had flowed so naturally before his arrival, became stilted and artificial as the other guests attempted to navigate the obvious tension between the royal couple, their discomfort increasing as Darnley's behavior grew more erratic and his comments more pointedly hostile toward the Italian secretary. As the evening progressed, the atmosphere in the small chamber grew thick with unspoken threats and barely contained violence, like the oppressive air that precedes a violent thunderstorm. The sound that shattered the peaceful atmosphere of Mary's supper chamber was not the gentle knock of a servant or the measured tread of a palace guard, but the crash of armed men forcing their way through doors that should have been secure, their footsteps echoing like drumbeats against the stone floors of Holyroodhouse Palace. Lord Ruthven appeared first in the doorway, his gaunt figure made even more terrifying by the armor he wore beneath his nightgown, his face pale as death itself yet animated by a fanatical gleam that spoke of purposes beyond ordinary human understanding. Behind him pressed other conspirators, their faces hidden in shadow but their intent unmistakable as their hands rested on sword hilts and dagger sheaths, men who had crossed the line from political opposition to violent action and would not be turned back by words or appeals to reason. The intimate supper chamber, which moments before had been a haven of civilized conversation, now became a trap from which there could be no escape except through blood and terror. The actual murder was accomplished with a savagery that shocked even the hardened conspirators who had planned it. George Douglas, the bastard son of the Earl of Morton, struck the first blow with Darnley's own dagger, the weapon having been provided by the king as his contribution to the night's work and his symbolic participation in the destruction of his wife's favorite. But the first wound was not fatal, and Riccio's agonized cries filled the chamber as other conspirators joined the attack, their blades rising and falling in a frenzy of violence that splattered blood across the tapestries and fine furnishings that had made the room a showcase of royal elegance. The Italian secretary's body, pierced by more than 50 wounds according to later testimony, was dragged from the Queen's presence and thrown down the palace stairs like refuse, his broken form coming to rest in the porter's lodge where curious servants would later count the dagger thrusts that had ended his life. The man who had risen from chapel singer to royal confidant through intelligence and talent lay dead in a pool of blood that seeped between the ancient stones, his ambitions and dreams extinguished by Scottish steel wielded in the name of Protestant righteousness and noble privilege. In the aftermath of the murder, as the conspirators attempted to restore some semblance of order to the chaos they had created, Mary found herself a prisoner in her own palace, surrounded by men whose violent actions had destroyed any pretense of loyalty or respect for her authority. Darnley, his participation in the night's work having been revealed by his provision of the murder weapon, now attempted to justify his betrayal through accusations against his wife, claiming that her relationship with Riccio had been more than professional, that the child she carried might not be his own, that his honor as a man and a king demanded the satisfaction that only blood could provide. These accusations, whether born of genuine suspicion or calculated malice, added psychological torture to the physical trauma Mary had endured, forcing her to defend not only her political judgment but her personal virtue while still reeling from the shock of witnessing brutal murder within arm's reach of her pregnant body. The other conspirators, perhaps recognizing that they had crossed a line from which there could be no return, attempted to present their actions as necessary for Scotland's salvation, claiming that Riccio had been plotting to restore papal authority through foreign invasion and that his removal was essential to preserve the nation's independence and Protestant faith. The political calculations behind the murder began to unravel almost immediately, as the conspirators discovered that eliminating Riccio had not solved their fundamental problems but had instead created new and more dangerous complications. News of the assassination spread through Edinburgh like wildfire, generating reactions that ranged from approval among hardcore Protestant factions to horror among moderates who recognized that murdering the Queen's secretary in her presence while she was pregnant constituted an unprecedented assault on royal dignity and authority. Foreign ambassadors, whose reports would shape European opinion of Scottish affairs, expressed shock at the brutality of the attack and concern about the stability of a kingdom where nobles felt free to commit murder in the sovereign's private chambers. Most seriously for the conspirators, their actions had revealed the depth of division within Scottish society, exposing the violent undercurrents that had been hidden beneath the surface of apparent political stability, making it clear that Mary's attempt to balance competing factions through compromise and moderation had failed catastrophically. Mary's immediate response to her captivity revealed the steel that lay beneath her courtly elegance, the survival instincts that she had inherited from ancestors who had fought for centuries to maintain Scottish independence against overwhelming odds. Rather than collapse into despair or rage, she began immediately to work for her freedom, using every weapon at her disposal: her personal charm, her political intelligence, her understanding of human nature, and above all, her ability to recognize and exploit the weaknesses in her enemy's position. She focused particularly on Darnley, whose guilt over his betrayal was already beginning to war with his fear of the consequences, whose realization that the conspirators regarded him as a tool rather than a partner was undermining his confidence in their cause. Through a combination of appeals to his conscience, reminders of their shared interests, and subtle threats about what might happen to him if the conspiracy failed, Mary began to detach her husband from his fellow plotters, convincing him that his best hope for survival lay in helping her rather than continuing to oppose her. The woman who had seemed helpless in the face of armed violence was already beginning to turn the tables on her captors, demonstrating the political skills that would serve her well in the even greater crises that lay ahead. The walls of Holyroodhouse Palace, which had sheltered Scottish royalty for generations, now served as Mary's prison as the conspirators attempted to consolidate their control over both the Queen and the kingdom she represented. In the days following Riccio's murder, Edinburgh seethed with tension as rumors spread through the narrow closes and winds of the Royal Mile, tales of foreign plots and royal adultery mixing with more sober concerns about the stability of a realm where armed nobles felt free to murder royal servants in the sovereign's presence. The palace itself had become an armed camp, with the conspirators' supporters controlling the gates and courtyards while Mary remained confined to her chambers, guarded by men whose loyalty had been purchased with promises of political advancement and religious reform. Yet beneath the surface of apparent rebel control, cracks were already beginning to appear in the conspiracy, fractures that Mary's keen political instincts would soon exploit to engineer one of the most dramatic escapes in royal history. The first weakness in the conspirators' position lay in their fundamental misunderstanding of Mary's character and capabilities. They had expected that the shock of witnessing Riccio's brutal murder, combined with the trauma of her own rough treatment while pregnant, would leave the Queen broken and compliant, willing to accept whatever political arrangements they chose to impose in exchange for her personal safety. Instead, they found themselves dealing with a woman whose royal education had included extensive training in the arts of survival and statecraft, whose years at the sophisticated French court had taught her how to navigate treacherous political waters, whose Stuart blood carried the genetic memory of ancestors who had defended Scottish independence against impossible odds. Mary's apparent cooperation with her captors masked a careful study of their weaknesses, their conflicting motivations, their fears and ambitions, all of which she catalogued with the precision of a general planning a military campaign. While the conspirators celebrated their apparent victory, their royal prisoner was already laying the groundwork for their destruction. The key to Mary's strategy lay in her recognition that the conspiracy against her had been held together more by hatred of Riccio than by any positive vision of Scotland's future. With the Italian secretary dead, the various factions began to pursue their own agendas, their unity dissolving as they discovered that removing a common enemy had not resolved their fundamental disagreements about religion, foreign policy, and the distribution of political power. The Protestant zealots, led by men like Lord Ruthven, wanted to use their temporary control to impose religious reforms that would eliminate Catholic influence entirely, while pragmatic nobles like the Earl of Morton were more interested in securing their own positions and enriching themselves from the spoils of victory. Darnley, whose participation had been essential to the conspiracy's initial success, now found himself increasingly isolated as the other conspirators made it clear that they regarded him as a useful fool rather than a true partner, their contempt for his character and abilities becoming more obvious with each passing day. Mary watched these divisions develop with the satisfaction of a master chess player whose opponents were destroying themselves through their own moves. The Queen's campaign to win back Darnley's loyalty began with private conversations in her guarded chambers, intimate discussions between husband and wife that the conspirators could not prevent without revealing the full extent of their distrust of their royal accomplice. Mary's approach was masterful in its psychological sophistication, combining appeals to Darnley's vanity with careful analysis of his increasingly precarious position, helping him understand that the men he had allied himself with viewed him as expendable once his usefulness had ended. She reminded him of the dreams they had once shared, the vision of ruling Scotland together as king and queen, the possibility of founding a dynasty that would unite the Scottish and English crowns under their descendants. More practically, she pointed out that his own survival depended upon hers, that the child she carried was his only hope for legitimate heirs, that the conspirators who had used him to commit regicide might well decide that a dead king could not testify about their treasonous activities. Most effectively of all, she appealed to whatever remained of his love for her, reminding him of the passion that had brought them together, a happiness they had known before ambition and jealousy had poisoned their marriage. As Mary worked to detach Darnley from the conspiracy, she also began reaching out to potential allies beyond the palace walls, using the network of loyal servants and secret Catholic sympathizers who had remained faithful despite the apparent triumph of her enemies. Messages written in code and concealed in seemingly innocent items made their way out of Holyrood House, carrying appeals for assistance to nobles who had been absent from Edinburgh during the murder, to Highland clans whose loyalty to the crown transcended religious differences, to foreign ambassadors whose governments had invested too much in Mary's success to abandon her without a fight. The Earl of Huntly, head of the most powerful Catholic family in Scotland, received word of Mary's situation and began quietly mobilizing his supporters, while the Earl of Bothwell, Mary's most capable military commander, gathered armed men in the borders, preparing for the conflict that now seemed inevitable. Even within Edinburgh itself, Mary's supporters began to organize, recognizing that the Queen's imprisonment represented a fundamental threat to the principle of royal authority that was the foundation of political order. The escape itself, when it finally came, demonstrated both Mary's courage and her political acumen, combining careful planning with split-second improvisation in a manner that would have impressed the most experienced military commander. On the night of March 11, barely 48 hours after Riccio's murder, Mary and Darnley slipped away from their guards using a secret passage that connected the royal apartments to the abbey church adjoining the palace. The ancient tunnels, originally constructed to allow the royal family to attend religious services without exposure to public view, now served as an escape route for a queen fleeing from her own nobles, the irony not lost on Mary as she made her way through passages her ancestors had walked in happier times. Darnley, whose knowledge of the palace's hidden ways proved invaluable, guided his pregnant wife through the darkness, perhaps finding in this act of assistance some redemption for his earlier betrayal, some restoration of the partnership that political ambition had nearly destroyed. Behind them, the palace guards continued their watch, unaware that their most important prisoners had vanished into the Edinburgh night like ghosts seeking refuge in their own kingdom. The ride from Edinburgh to Dunbar Castle, undertaken through the darkness of a March night with only the most trusted companions, tested Mary's physical endurance to its limits while demonstrating the loyalty that still existed among her supporters despite the apparent success of her enemies. Mounted on swift horses provided by allies who had risked their own lives to assist the Queen's escape, Mary and her small party rode hard through the Scottish countryside, following ancient paths that avoided the main roads where the conspirators might have established checkpoints. The Queen, 6 months pregnant and still recovering from the trauma of witnessing murder in her own chambers, endured the jarring ride with the stoicism of a warrior, her determination to reach safety overcoming physical discomfort and the ever-present fear of pursuit. As dawn broke over the hills of East Lothian, revealing the massive walls of Dunbar Castle rising from its clifftop perch above the North Sea, Mary must have felt that she had achieved the impossible, transforming apparent defeat into the foundation for eventual victory through courage, intelligence, and the loyalty of subjects who refused to abandon their anointed queen. The woman who had been a prisoner at sunset was free by sunrise, ready to begin the campaign that would restore her authority and punish those who had dared to raise their hands against her person and her crown. In the aftermath of Mary's dramatic escape from Holyrood House, the political landscape of Scotland shifted like sand beneath the feet of all who sought to navigate its treacherous currents. The conspirators who had believed themselves masters of the kingdom found their authority evaporating as quickly as morning mist, their support melting away as nobles calculated the odds and decided that loyalty to an escaped queen offered better prospects than alliance with regicides whose cause was already failing. From the ancient battlements of Dunbar Castle, where waves crashed against rocky cliffs and sea winds carried the salt tang of freedom, Mary began the process of reasserting her royal authority, gathering an army of loyal supporters who flocked to her banner with the enthusiasm of subjects who had feared their queen was lost forever. Within days, what had appeared to be a successful coup had transformed into a desperate flight. The conspirators scattered to the winds while Mary returned to Edinburgh in triumph, her courage and political skill having turned apparent disaster into renewed strength. Yet Mary's victory over the Riccio conspirators, complete as it appeared, carried within it the seeds of future catastrophe, for it brought to prominence a man whose influence over the Queen would ultimately prove even more destructive than her ill-fated marriage to Darnley. James Hepburn, 4th Earl of Bothwell, had been Mary's most effective supporter during her time of greatest peril, his military expertise and ruthless efficiency having proved invaluable in gathering the forces that made her restoration possible. Bothwell was everything that Darnley was not, experienced in warfare rather than courtly pursuits, practical rather than romantic, decisive rather than vacillating, a man of action who had spent his life on the violent borderlands where survival depended upon strength and cunning rather than noble birth or poetic accomplishments. Standing nearly 6 feet tall with the powerful build of a professional soldier, his scarred hands bearing witness to countless battles, Bothwell embodied the warrior tradition that had created Scottish independence and might yet preserve it against all enemies, foreign and domestic. In the Queen's hour of greatest need, he had proved himself the most reliable of her defenders, and Mary's gratitude would soon blossom into something far more dangerous than simple political alliance. Bothwell's rise to prominence in Mary's inner circle occurred with startling rapidity, his proven loyalty during the Riccio crisis elevating him from border chieftain to indispensable advisor in a matter of weeks. Unlike the Italian secretary whose influence had been based upon cultural sophistication and intellectual compatibility, Bothwell's appeal lay in his embodiment of masculine strength and protective capability, qualities that seemed especially valuable to a queen who had recently experienced the ultimate vulnerability of witnessing murder in her own chambers. Mary began to rely upon Bothwell not merely for military advice but for personal security, surrounding herself with his armed retainers, seeking his counsel on matters both political and personal, gradually creating a relationship of dependence that worried even her most loyal supporters. The French ambassador reported to his master that the Scottish Queen seemed to have developed an almost superstitious faith in Bothwell's ability to protect her from harm, as if his presence could somehow shield her from the violent currents that ran through Scottish politics like underground rivers waiting to burst into destructive flood. The nature of Mary's relationship with Bothwell became a source of speculation and scandal throughout the courts of Europe, contemporary observers struggling to understand how a queen renowned for her refinement and culture could become so closely associated with a man whose reputation was built upon violence and ruthless pragmatism. Some attributed her attachment to simple gratitude, arguing that Mary's reliance upon Bothwell reflected nothing more than recognition of his proven loyalty and military competence. Others saw in their relationship the natural attraction between a woman who had been betrayed by her husband and a man whose strength and decisiveness offered the security that her marriage had failed to provide. Most cynically, political observers suggested that Mary had simply recognized Bothwell as the strongest of her remaining supporters and had decided to bind him to her cause through whatever means proved necessary, using her personal magnetism as a political weapon in the struggle for survival. Yet beneath all these rational explanations lay whispers of something more dangerous and more destructive, the possibility that Mary Queen of Scots, who had already sacrificed political advantage for romantic attachment once before, was once again allowing passion to overcome prudence, heart to triumph overhead. The crisis that would destroy Mary's marriage and ultimately her reign began building in late 1566, as her relationship with Darnley deteriorated beyond any possibility of repair despite their temporary reconciliation during the escape from Edinburgh. Darnley's participation in the Riccio conspiracy, even though he had ultimately assisted in Mary's escape, had created a wound in their marriage that proved impossible to heal, a breach of trust so fundamental that it poisoned every subsequent interaction between husband and wife. Mary's pregnancy, which should have been a time of shared anticipation and renewed intimacy, instead became a period of growing estrangement as Darnley's jealousy and paranoia reached new heights, his accusations about the paternity of Mary's child growing ever more public and more vicious. The birth of Prince James in June 1566, an event that should have crowned Mary's success as queen and woman, was overshadowed by Darnley's continued drinking, his increasingly erratic behavior, and his transparent attempts to undermine Mary's authority through public displays of contempt and private conspiracies with her enemies. The man who had once swept Mary off her feet with romantic gestures and courtly charm had become a millstone around her neck, a source of constant embarrassment and political liability whose very presence threatened to destroy everything she had worked to achieve. As 1567 began, the question of what to do about Darnley became the central issue of Scottish politics, a problem that had no easy solution and threatened to tear the kingdom apart regardless of how it was resolved. Mary could not simply divorce her husband, for such an action would bastardize Prince James and throw the succession into chaos, potentially giving England the excuse it needed to intervene in Scottish affairs under the pretext of protecting the infant prince's rights. Yet continuing to tolerate Darnley's behavior was equally impossible, his public displays of drunkenness and his private conspiracies making effective government increasingly difficult while undermining Mary's reputation both at home and abroad. Some of Mary's advisors quietly suggested that the only permanent solution to the Darnley problem was his death, whether by natural causes, convenient accident, or more direct action, a suggestion that reflected the brutal realities of 16th-century politics where inconvenient relatives had a tendency to meet untimely ends. Whether Mary herself ever explicitly endorsed such solutions remains one of history's great mysteries, but the very fact that such discussions were taking place created an atmosphere of deadly intrigue that would soon engulf the Scottish court in violence even more devastating than the Riccio murder. The events of February 9 to 10, 1567, would provide the solution to Mary's Darnley problem while simultaneously creating problems far greater than any her unfortunate marriage had caused. On that cold winter night, the house of Kirklefield, where Darnley had been staying while recovering from what may have been syphilis, exploded in a blast so powerful that it woke half of Edinburgh and sent debris flying across the surrounding countryside. When searchers arrived at the scene, they found Darnley's body in the garden, apparently thrown clear of the explosion but bearing no signs of burns or injury from the blast, suggesting that Scotland's king had died not from gunpowder but from more personal violence, perhaps strangled or suffocated before the explosion that was meant to conceal the evidence of murder. The death of Henry Stuart, Lord Darnley, solved Mary's immediate problem while creating suspicions and accusations that would follow her for the rest of her life, transforming her from victim of her husband's inadequacies into suspect in his murder, from sympathetic figure into dangerous woman whose very presence threatened the stability of the realm. As smoke rose from the ruins of Kirklefield and Edinburgh buzzed with rumors of royal murder, Mary Queen of Scots began her final descent toward the abyss that would ultimately swallow her crown, her freedom, and eventually her life. The explosion at Kirklefield that ended Darnley's life sent shockwaves through Scotland and across Europe that had nothing to do with the force of the gunpowder that had destroyed the house where the king lay dying. Within hours of the discovery of Darnley's strangled corpse in the garden, Edinburgh was buzzing with whispered speculation about who had ordered the murder and why, the brutal efficiency of the assassination suggesting careful planning and considerable resources rather than the desperate act of an individual assassin. Suspicion fell immediately upon those who had the most to gain from Darnley's death, and at the top of that list stood Mary herself, whose troubled marriage and political difficulties provided obvious motives for removing an inconvenient husband through violent means. The fact that Mary had visited Darnley at Kirklefield on the evening of his death, ostensibly to attend a wedding celebration but conveniently departing before the explosion, only added fuel to the fires of suspicion that would soon consume her reputation and ultimately her throne. Even more damaging to Mary's position was the widespread belief that the Earl of Bothwell had been the instrument of Darnley's destruction, the man whose military expertise and ruthless character made him the obvious choice to carry out such a carefully orchestrated assassination. Bothwell's enemies were quick to point out that he possessed both the means and the motive to eliminate the king, his control over border ruffians providing the manpower necessary for such an operation, while his growing influence over Mary gave him every reason to remove the husband who stood between him and even greater power. Anonymous placards began appearing on the walls of Edinburgh churches and public buildings, crude but effective propaganda pieces that depicted Bothwell as a murderer and Mary as his willing accomplice, their graphic imagery and inflammatory language designed to turn public opinion against the Queen who had once been welcomed back from France with such enthusiasm. The most damaging of these placards showed a crowned hare, representing Mary, fleeing toward a circle of swords, representing Bothwell, with the clear implication that the Queen was rushing into the arms of her husband's killer. Whether these placards reflected genuine popular outrage or carefully orchestrated political propaganda designed to destroy Mary's reputation, their effect was devastating, transforming her from tragic widow into suspected murderess in the space of a few weeks. The investigation into Darnley's murder, such as it was, revealed the weakness of Mary's position and the depth of opposition she now faced from nobles who had once supported her. A formal trial was indeed held, with Bothwell facing charges related to the king's death, but the proceedings were a transparent mockery of justice that satisfied no one and convinced few of anything beyond the corruption that now permeated Scottish politics. Bothwell appeared at the trial accompanied by 4,000 of his armed retainers, a show of force that made clear to all observers that this was not a court of law but a demonstration of political power, the accused man's ability to fill Edinburgh with his supporters effectively preventing any serious examination of the evidence against him. The Earl of Lennox, Darnley's father and the most logical person to pursue justice for his son's murder, was prevented from attending by the obvious threat of violence that surrounded the proceedings, his absence making it impossible for any serious accusations to be presented against Bothwell. When the inevitable verdict of not guilty was announced, few in Scotland believed that justice had been served, but all understood that Bothwell had demonstrated his power and Mary had shown herself either unwilling or unable to control the man who was increasingly seen as the true ruler of Scotland. What happened next shocked even observers who thought themselves prepared for any development in the increasingly bizarre drama of Scottish politics. On April 24, 1567, barely 3 months after Darnley's murder and only weeks after Bothwell's acquittal, Mary was apparently kidnapped while travelling from Stirling to Edinburgh, seized by armed men under Bothwell's command and carried off to his stronghold at Dunbar Castle. The official story, as later presented to foreign courts and Scottish nobles, was that Bothwell had acted without Mary's knowledge or consent, that the Queen had been overpowered and abducted against her will by a subject who had forgotten his duty and his place. Yet suspicious observers noted that Mary's captivity at Dunbar seemed remarkably comfortable, that she was attended by her usual servants and showed no signs of physical distress or psychological trauma, that her protests against her treatment seemed more formal than genuine. The possibility that Mary had colluded in her own kidnapping, that the entire episode was an elaborate charade designed to provide political cover for a marriage that both parties wanted but neither dared to arrange openly, became the subject of intense speculation throughout Scotland and Europe. The marriage of Mary Queen of Scots to James Hepburn, 4th Earl of Bothwell, celebrated at Holyroodhouse Palace on May 15, 1567, represented the culmination of a romance that had transformed both participants from respected political figures into pariahs whose very names became synonymous with scandal and disgrace. The ceremony itself was a subdued affair, conducted according to Protestant rites despite Mary's Catholic faith, attended by only a handful of supporters brave enough or calculating enough to associate themselves publicly with what most observers regarded as the ultimate act of political suicide. Gone were the magnificent celebrations that had marked Mary's previous wedding to Darnley, the crowds of cheering subjects, the sense of national celebration that should accompany a royal marriage, replaced instead by an atmosphere of barely concealed hostility and open disapproval that made clear how completely Mary had alienated her people. The bride who had once been hailed as the most beautiful and accomplished princess in Europe now stood beside a groom whom many regarded as her husband's murderer, their union blessed by few and cursed by many, their future together already shadowed by the violence and suspicion that had brought them to this moment. The political consequences of Mary's marriage to Bothwell were immediate and catastrophic, uniting her enemies while alienating even those supporters who had remained loyal through all her previous crises. The Scottish nobles who had accepted Mary's Catholicism, tolerated her French education, and even forgiven her disastrous first marriage now found themselves faced with a queen who had apparently connived in her husband's murder and married his killer, actions that violated every standard of royal behavior and Christian morality that the 16th century recognized. Religious leaders across the Protestant spectrum denounced the marriage as an abomination before God, while Catholic authorities expressed horror at Mary's willingness to participate in a Protestant ceremony with a man whose character made him unsuitable for any Christian sacrament. Foreign courts that had once competed for Mary's alliance now distanced themselves from a queen whose reputation had been so thoroughly destroyed that association with her threatened to damage their own international standing. Most dangerously of all, Mary's marriage to Bothwell provided her enemies with the perfect rallying cry, allowing them to present their rebellion not as treason against their anointed sovereign but as righteous action to save Scotland from a corrupted monarchy that threatened the very foundations of civilized society. The final confrontation between Mary and her rebellious subjects came at Carberry Hill on June 15, 1567, barely a month after her marriage to Bothwell, in a battle that would determine not just the fate of a kingdom but the destiny of one of history's most tragic figures. The armies faced each other across a field that had witnessed countless conflicts between Scots and English, but this time the battle lines divided families and friends, pitting subjects against their anointed queen in a conflict that struck at the very heart of the bonds that held society together. Mary herself appeared on the battlefield, her presence intended to inspire loyalty among her supporters while demonstrating to the world that she remained Scotland's rightful sovereign regardless of the opposition she faced. Yet the queen who had once commanded such devotion from her people now found herself leading an army whose loyalty was questionable, men who followed her more from habit than conviction, soldiers who might desert at the first sign that the battle was turning against their cause. As the day wore on without decisive action, it became clear that Mary's support was melting away like snow in summer, her followers abandoning the field rather than fight their fellow Scots in what increasingly appeared to be a hopeless cause. The fortress of Lochleven Castle rose from the dark waters of its loch like a stone monument to despair, its ancient walls now serving as the prison of a queen whose fall from grace had shocked the courts of Europe and plunged Scotland into political chaos. Mary's confinement on the small island began in June 1567, barely days after her surrender at Carberry Hill, the speed of her imprisonment demonstrating how completely her enemies had prepared for this moment and how thoroughly they intended to prevent any possibility of her restoration to power. The castle itself was owned by the Douglas family, whose loyalty to the Confederate lords was absolute and whose hatred of Mary had been refined through years of political opposition into an instrument of refined cruelty disguised as lawful detention. The island's isolation made escape virtually impossible while its comfort was sufficient to prevent accusations of outright barbarism, creating the perfect combination of security and plausible deniability that Mary's enemies required to justify their treatment of their anointed sovereign. The conditions of Mary's imprisonment at Lochleven were designed to break her spirit while preserving her life, a careful balance between punishment and pragmatism that reflected the complex political calculations of her captors. She was housed in comfortable chambers within the castle's main tower, her quarters furnished with tapestries and fine furniture that maintained some semblance of royal dignity while making clear that she was now dependent upon her enemies' charity for even the most basic comforts. Her household was reduced to a handful of loyal servants, women who had followed their queen into exile and imprisonment, their devotion providing Mary with the only human warmth available in her stone prison surrounded by cold water and colder hearts. Books were provided for her amusement, carefully selected volumes that included religious works and classical literature but excluded anything that might be construed as politically inflammatory or useful for communicating with potential supporters beyond the castle walls. The routine of captivity gradually imposed itself upon the woman who had once commanded the movements of courts and armies, her days now measured not by state ceremonies and diplomatic receptions but by the simple rhythms of prayer, reading, and needlework that filled the empty hours of imprisonment. The most devastating blow to Mary's hopes came with the demand that she abdicate her throne in favor of her infant son, Prince James, a political maneuver that would legitimize the Confederate Lords' rebellion while providing a legal foundation for their continued control of Scottish government. The abdication document, presented to Mary in her island prison with barely concealed threats of what might happen if she refused to sign, represented the final destruction of everything she had worked to achieve since her return from France. Her signature on the parchment would transform her from rightful Queen of Scotland into a private citizen without legal standing, her authority transferred to a child who could not exercise it and regents who would rule in his name according to their own interests rather than hers. Yet the alternative to signing, as her captors made clear through subtle hints and meaningful silences, might well be a convenient accident or sudden illness that would remove her permanently from the political equation while allowing the regency to proceed with a clear conscience. Faced with this impossible choice, Mary chose survival over principle, her signature on the abdication document marking the legal end of her reign even as she privately resolved never to accept the finality of what had been forced upon her through violence and intimidation. The months that followed Mary's forced abdication brought a strange mixture of despair and determination, as the former queen struggled to accept her circumstances while secretly planning for the restoration that she believed must eventually come. News from the outside world filtered into Lochleven through whispered conversations with servants, coded messages hidden in seemingly innocent letters, and the careful observations of visitors whose loyalties were not entirely clear to her captors. Mary learned of the establishment of a regency government headed by her half-brother the Earl of Moray, whose Protestant credentials and apparent competence had won him support from nobles who might otherwise have opposed any change in Scotland's traditional monarchy. Yet she also received hints that not all of Scotland's people had accepted her abdication as legitimate, that supporters still existed who regarded her as their rightful queen regardless of what documents she had been forced to sign under duress. The possibility of restoration, however remote it might seem from her island prison, provided Mary with the psychological strength necessary to endure captivity while planning for an eventual return to power that would vindicate her sufferings and punish those who had dared to raise their hands against their anointed sovereign. The turning point in Mary's captivity came through an unexpected source: the romantic attachment of George Douglas, younger brother of her chief captor, whose youthful idealism and susceptibility to Mary's considerable personal charm gradually transformed him from guardian into potential accomplice in her escape plans. George Douglas was everything that the hardened political operatives surrounding Mary were not: young, impressionable, romantic in his outlook, and possessed of the kind of chivalric ideals that made service to a beautiful and wronged queen seem like the highest form of honor rather than the basest form of treason. Mary's cultivation of this unlikely ally demonstrated the political skills that had served her well in more fortunate circumstances, her ability to read character and exploit weakness proving as valuable in captivity as it had been in the courts of Europe. Through carefully managed conversations, shared interests in poetry and music, and the subtle deployment of her still considerable beauty and charm, Mary gradually won George Douglas to her cause, transforming her prison guard into her most devoted supporter and eventual instrument of liberation. The process took months of patient work, each conversation building upon previous ones, each small gesture of kindness and understanding gradually binding the young man more closely to her service, until he reached the point where helping Mary escape seemed not like betrayal of his family but like fulfillment of his highest duty as a gentleman and a Christian. The escape plan that eventually took shape reflected both Mary's desperation and her continued ability to inspire loyalty among those who came to know her personally rather than simply as a political symbol. Willie Douglas, a young page in the castle household and possible illegitimate member of the Douglas family, was recruited to assist in the enterprise, his youth and apparent innocence making him the perfect messenger and accomplice in activities that would have aroused immediate suspicion if attempted by more obvious supporters. The plan itself was elegant in its simplicity. During the confusion of a celebration feast, the castle keys would be borrowed long enough to allow Mary and her small party to reach the boats that provided the island's only connection to the mainland, where horses and loyal supporters would be waiting to carry the queen to safety among allies who remained faithful to her cause. Every detail was carefully planned and rehearsed, alternative routes established in case the primary escape route was discovered, loyal supporters positioned at strategic points along the intended path of flight, safe houses identified where Mary could rest and recover before attempting to rebuild her political position. The success of the enterprise would depend upon perfect timing, absolute loyalty from all participants, and a considerable measure of good fortune, but for Mary the risks seemed acceptable compared to the certainty of indefinite imprisonment and the possibility of convenient death that constantly hung over her captivity. The night of May 2, 1568, brought to Lechleven Castle the kind of spring storm that seemed to mirror the tempest of emotions surrounding Mary's desperate bid for freedom, wind and rain lashing the ancient walls while inside the fortress the drama of escape and betrayal played out with all the intensity of a tragic romance. The banquet that provided cover for the escape attempt filled the great hall with laughter and music, the Douglas family and their guests celebrating some forgotten anniversary while the woman they held prisoner waited in her chambers for the signal that would either restore her to liberty or condemn her to a death that might come disguised as accident or sudden illness. Willie Douglas, the young page whose loyalty Mary had carefully cultivated, moved through the festivities with practiced innocence, his boyish appearance concealing nerves stretched to breaking point as he watched for the perfect moment to implement the plan that would either make him a hero or a corpse before dawn broke over the lock. The castle keys, hanging from the belt of the unsuspecting steward, represented the difference between continued captivity and the possibility of restoration, their theft requiring timing so perfect and luck so extraordinary that the enterprise seemed to balance on the edge of impossibility. The actual escape unfolded with the kind of dramatic precision that seemed almost too perfect to be believable, each element of the plan working exactly as hoped despite the countless opportunities for discovery and disaster. Willie Douglas succeeded in lifting the keys during a moment when the steward's attention was focused on settling a dispute between drunken guests, the boy's small hands working with the deftness of a professional thief while his face maintained the blank expression of a servant going about his routine duties. Mary, warned by a prearranged signal, gathered her few trusted companions and made her way through corridors she had memorized during months of careful observation, her heart pounding with excitement and terror as she approached the liberation she had dreamed of throughout her captivity. The boat that carried her across the dark waters of the loch seemed to Mary like Charon's ferry in reverse, bearing her not toward the underworld but back toward the realm of the living, each stroke of the oars carrying her farther from the island prison where she had nearly lost both crown and hope. Behind her, the lights of Lechleven Castle glowed like malevolent eyes in the darkness, but ahead lay the mainland and the possibility of restoration to the throne that was hers by right of birth and inheritance. The immediate aftermath of Mary's escape demonstrated both the continued loyalty she commanded among certain segments of Scottish society and the deep divisions that her reign had created within the kingdom. Word of her liberation spread through Scotland with supernatural speed, carried by messengers whose very existence proved that networks of support had survived despite months of persecution by the Regency government. Within days, an army began to gather around Mary's banner, composed of men whose motives ranged from genuine loyalty to their rightful queen to simple opposition to the rule of the Earl of Moray and his Protestant allies. The Hamilton family, whose ancient rivalry with the Douglases made them natural enemies of Mary's former captors, provided both leadership and military expertise to the growing force, while Highland clans whose Catholic sympathies had been suppressed during the Regency now saw an opportunity to restore both their queen and their faith to positions of power and influence. For a brief, shining moment, it seemed that Mary might indeed succeed in recovering her throne through the same combination of courage, luck, and popular support that had enabled her escape from Lochleven. The Battle of Langside, fought on May 13, 1568, barely 11 days after Mary's escape from captivity, would determine whether the former queen's bid for restoration would succeed or whether she would be forced into an exile from which there might be no return. The armies that faced each other on the field south of Glasgow represented more than competing claims to political authority, they embodied irreconcilable visions of Scotland's future, with Mary's supporters fighting for the restoration of traditional monarchy and Catholic influence while Moray's forces defended the Protestant settlement and the principle that royal authority must be subordinate to noble consent. Mary herself watched the battle from a nearby hilltop, her presence intended to inspire her followers while demonstrating to friend and enemy alike that she remained committed to recovering her birthright regardless of the personal cost. The sight of her royal standard flying once again over Scottish troops must have stirred emotions in the Queen that combined hope and terror in equal measure, the knowledge that victory would restore everything she had lost while defeat might mean death or permanent exile from the land she considered home. The defeat at Langside proved swift and decisive, Mary's hastily assembled army crumbling before the disciplined forces of her half-brother Moray and a rout so complete that it seemed to settle the question of her restoration once and for all. The Earl of Argyll, Mary's principal military commander, suffered what may have been a convenient epileptic fit at the crucial moment of the battle, his collapse leaving the royal forces without effective leadership just when decisive action might have turned the tide of combat. Whether Argyll's illness was genuine or politically motivated remained a subject of speculation, but its effect was undeniable. Mary's army dissolved into panicked flight, leaving behind weapons, banners, and any hope of immediate restoration to the Scottish throne. The Queen herself, watching her cause collapse from her observation point, faced the terrible choice between capture by enemies who had already demonstrated their willingness to imprison her and flight to an uncertain future in foreign lands where her reception might prove no more welcoming than the Scotland that had rejected her. The woman who had once commanded the loyalty of French courts and Scottish nobles now found herself a refugee in her own kingdom, dependent upon the speed of her horse and the loyalty of a handful of companions for her very survival. The decision to flee to England, made in the immediate aftermath of Langside while Mary's enemies were still pursuing her across the Scottish countryside, would prove to be the final and most faithful miscalculation of her political career. England represented the logical refuge for a Scottish queen in distress, the only neighboring kingdom with sufficient power to protect her from her enemies while potentially providing the military support necessary for her eventual restoration. Elizabeth Tudor, Mary's cousin and fellow queen, had always maintained diplomatic relations with Scotland's rightful sovereign despite their religious differences and competing claims to various thrones, suggesting that personal and political considerations might combine to ensure Mary's safety south of the border. Most importantly, Mary's valid claim to the English succession, based on her descent from Margaret Tudor, provided Elizabeth with compelling reasons to treat her as a valuable political asset rather than an inconvenient refugee, a potential ally whose restoration to the Scottish throne might serve English interests better than continued support for the unstable Regency government. These calculations, reasonable as they seemed at the time, failed to account for the fundamental change in Mary's position that her flight to England would represent: transformation from inconvenient neighbor into dangerous guest, from foreign queen into domestic threat, from political ally into potential rival whose very presence would create problems that could only be solved through indefinite detention or permanent elimination. The crossing of the Solway Firth on May 16, 1568, marked not just Mary's physical departure from Scotland but her symbolic transition from reigning queen to political refugee, a change in status that would define the remaining 19 years of her life. The small fishing boat that carried Mary across the narrow stretch of water separating Scotland from England seemed to the fleeing queen like a bridge to safety and eventual restoration, but in reality it was ferrying her toward a captivity far more subtle and ultimately more deadly than the stone walls of Lochleven Castle. Behind her lay the kingdom she had tried so hard to rule wisely and well, the misty highlands and ancient castles that represented not just political power but spiritual home, the realm that had shaped her identity even during her long exile in France. Ahead lay England, that powerful neighbor whose relationship with Scotland had always balanced between alliance and domination, friendship and conquest, protection and absorption. Mary could not have known, as her boat touched the English shore and she set foot on foreign soil as a supplicant rather than a sovereign, that she would never again see Scotland except in dreams and memories, that the decision to seek Elizabeth's protection had sealed her fate as surely as any executioner's warrant. The years of Mary's imprisonment in England unfolded with the slow, inexorable rhythm of water wearing away stone, each day bringing small erosions of hope and dignity that cumulatively transformed the vibrant young queen who had fled Scotland into the tragic figure who would eventually face Elizabeth Tudor's executioner with such remarkable courage and grace. Her initial detention at Carlisle Castle, ostensibly for her own protection while Elizabeth's government investigated the circumstances of her arrival, quickly revealed itself as the beginning of a captivity that would last nearly 2 decades, shifting from fortress to manor house to palace prison as Mary's status evolved from honored guest to suspected conspirator to condemned traitor. The English authorities who managed Mary's detention faced the constant challenge of maintaining security while preserving the diplomatic fiction that they were protecting rather than imprisoning a fellow sovereign, a balancing act that required elaborate protocols, comfortable accommodations, and careful attention to Mary's dignity even as they systematically eliminated any possibility of her escape or restoration. The castle of Fotheringhay, where Mary spent her final months and where she would eventually meet her death, rose from the flat Northamptonshire countryside like a monument to royal power and royal mortality, its ancient stones having witnessed the imprisonment and execution of other inconvenient claimants to English thrones. The chamber where Mary lived during her last captivity was comfortable by the standards of 16th-century imprisonment, furnished with tapestries and fine furniture that maintained some semblance of royal dignity while making clear that she remained absolutely dependent upon Elizabeth's charity for every comfort and convenience. Her household, reduced to a handful of loyal servants who had followed their mistress into exile and captivity, provided Mary with the only human warmth available in her stone prison, their devotion offering proof that royal loyalty could survive even the complete destruction of royal power. The routine of captivity gradually imposed itself upon the woman who had once commanded the movements of courts and armies, her days now measured not by state ceremonies and diplomatic receptions but by the simple rhythms of prayer, reading, needlework, and correspondence that filled the empty hours of imprisonment with purposeful activity designed to maintain sanity and hope despite overwhelming evidence that neither restoration nor release would ever come. The network of Catholic conspiracies that swirled around Mary's person during her English captivity reflected both the continuing loyalty she commanded among her coreligionists and the growing desperation of those who saw in her a symbol of their own oppressed faith and frustrated political ambitions. The Ridolfi plot, the Throckmorton plot, the Babington conspiracy, each successive scheme promised Mary's liberation and restoration while actually tightening the net around her, providing Elizabeth's spy network with evidence of treason that could be used to justify increasingly harsh treatment of the captive queen. Sir Francis Walsingham, Elizabeth's secretary and spymaster, managed these conspiracies with the skill of a master chess player, allowing them to develop just far enough to implicate Mary while ensuring that they never posed any real threat to English security or Elizabeth's position. Mary's own role in these plots remained ambiguous, her correspondence carefully crafted to provide encouragement to potential rescuers while maintaining plausible deniability about her involvement in any specific plans for assassination or rebellion. Yet the very existence of such correspondence, regardless of its precise meaning or intent, provided Walsingham with the documentary evidence necessary to construct a case for treason that would ultimately justify Mary's execution as a legal necessity rather than a political convenience. The Babington plot of 1586, the final and most elaborate of the conspiracies surrounding Mary's captivity, provided Elizabeth's government with the pretext it needed to bring the long drama of Mary Queen of Scots to its inevitable conclusion. Anthony Babington, a young Catholic gentleman whose romantic idealism made him the perfect tool for Walsingham's purposes, organized a conspiracy that promised not only Mary's liberation but Elizabeth's assassination, the replacement of Protestant rule with Catholic monarchy, and the restoration of papal authority throughout England. The plot was doomed from its inception, penetrated so thoroughly by government agents that every move was known to Walsingham before it was made, every letter intercepted and decoded, every meeting observed and recorded. Mary's correspondence with Babington, conducted through an elaborate cipher system that the conspirators believed was secure but which had actually been broken by government cryptographers, provided the documentary evidence that sealed her fate. Her apparent approval of Elizabeth's assassination transforming her from inconvenient prisoner into dangerous traitor whose continued existence posed an intolerable threat to English security and Protestant settlement. The trial of Mary Queen of Scots, conducted at Fotheringhay Castle in October 1586, represented the culmination of nearly 20 years of legal and political maneuvering designed to transform a fellow sovereign into a common traitor subject to English law and English justice. Mary's defense, conducted with dignity and legal sophistication despite her lack of formal training in English law, challenged the fundamental premises upon which the prosecution rested, arguing that as an anointed queen she could not be subject to the jurisdiction of any earthly court, that her captivity invalidated any apparent consent to English authority, that the evidence against her had been obtained through entrapment and forgery designed to create crimes rather than discover them. Her performance during the trial revealed the intelligence and strength of character that had made her such a formidable political opponent throughout her career, her responses to questions displaying both legal acumen and moral authority that impressed even her enemies while failing to save her from a verdict that had been predetermined by political necessity rather than legal evidence. The commissioners who condemned Mary to death did so not because they were convinced of her guilt under any reasonable interpretation of English law, but because her continued existence had become incompatible with Elizabeth's security and the stability of the Protestant settlement that defined English national identity. Elizabeth Tudor's agonized hesitation before signing Mary's death warrant reflected not mercy or sisterly feeling but the profound political implications of executing a fellow sovereign, implications that would reverberate throughout Europe and might provoke the very Catholic invasion that Mary's death was supposed to prevent. 4 months after Mary's conviction, the English Queen wavered between political necessity and royal solidarity, recognizing that Mary's execution would solve immediate problems while creating new ones, that removing a dangerous rival might provoke dangerous enemies, that the precedent of regicide might someday return to haunt Elizabeth herself. The final decision came not through careful calculation but through a moment of frustrated anger when Elizabeth signed the warrant and immediately ordered its dispatch to Fotheringhay, as if speed might somehow reduce the moral weight of what she was authorizing. Yet no sooner had the warrant left her hands than Elizabeth began to regret her decision, sending contradictory messages to her officials, attempting to recall the authorization for Mary's death even as she knew that political momentum had passed beyond her control and that the terrible machinery of judicial murder was already in motion. And so we reach the end of Mary Stuart's extraordinary journey, from the palace of her birth to the scaffold of her death, from the heights of royal power to the depths of captivity and despair, from the promises of youth to the tragic fulfillment of prophecies that seemed too dark to believe. Her story reminds us that history is not simply a series of political events or military conflicts, but the accumulation of human choices made by individuals who faced impossible circumstances with whatever wisdom, courage, and faith they could summon from within their hearts. Mary Queen of Scots was neither the perfect martyr her supporters claimed nor the scheming murderess her enemies portrayed, but something more complex and more human, a woman whose extraordinary circumstances revealed both the nobility and the frailty that define us all. Feel your body relaxing into the softness of your bed, your muscles releasing the tension of the day as sleep begins to claim you. The tragic queen who captivated and divided her age now rests in peace, her struggles ended, her story complete. Let her rest carry you gently toward your own peaceful slumber, where dreams may bring kinder fates than history provided, where the weight of crowns dissolves into the lightness of sleep. Rest now, as Mary rests, in the quiet embrace of night and the gentle promise that tomorrow's dawn will bring new possibilities, new hopes, new chances for the human spirit to rise above the circumstances that would confine it. Sleep well, and let history's lessons fade into the background as your own rest begins. If you're still awake, that's okay. Just close your eyes and let the story carry you. Subscribe to History for Sleep for a new story every week. Sweet dreams.